Food delivery horror stories. Story 1. The unfinished house. It was a cold, foggy night, and I was nearing the end of my shift delivering food for a local pizza place. The orders had been pretty standard, nothing out of the ordinary, until I got a delivery request for a house on the outskirts of town. The address wasn't familiar to me, and I'd been working this area for years. The GPS led me down a long, winding road that seemed to go on forever, deeper and deeper into the countryside. As I drove, the fog grew thicker, making it hard to see even a few feet ahead. Eventually, I reached a turnoff that led to a narrow gravel road. The GPS insisted that this was the way, so I followed it, despite my growing unease. After a few minutes, I arrived at what looked like a large construction site. The house was huge, but it was clearly unfinished. There was scaffolding, piles of bricks, and half-built walls everywhere. The place looked like it had been abandoned midway through construction. I parked my car and got out, carrying the pizza box. The cold air sent shivers down my spine, and the silence was unnerving. There were no lights on, and the house loomed in the fog like a ghostly figure. I approached what appeared to be the front door, a large wooden structure that seemed out of place on the unfinished house. I knocked, but there was no answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. Just as I was about to leave, the door creaked open. I called out, "Hello, I have your delivery." But there was no response. The darkness inside was impenetrable, and the fog seemed to creep in and around the edges of the door. I felt a strong urge to leave, but something compelled me to step inside. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped inside. I tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. The air inside was thick with dust, and the smell of damp wood was overwhelming. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and looked around. The interior of the house was just as unfinished as the outside, bare walls, exposed beams, and floors covered in debris. But what really unnerved me were the strange symbols painted on the walls, symbols I couldn't recognize. I started to explore, hoping to find another way out. The house seemed to go on forever, with long, narrow hallways and rooms that were all incomplete. In one room, I found an old, dusty mirror leaning against the wall. As I passed by it, I caught a glimpse of movement behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. I tried to stay calm, but the sense of being watched grew stronger with every step I took. The shadows seemed to shift and move, playing tricks on my mind. I heard faint whispers coming from the walls, too quiet to make out, but enough to send chills down my spine. Finally, I found a staircase leading down to what I assumed was the basement. Desperate to find a way out, I descended into the darkness. The stairs creaked under my weight, and the air grew colder with each step. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a large open space. The walls were lined with more of those strange symbols, and in the center of the room was a large stone altar, stained dark with something I didn't want to think about. I backed away, my heart racing. Just as I turned to run back up the stairs, the lights flickered on, revealing a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was a man, dressed in tattered clothing, with a wild look in his eyes. He smiled at me, a twisted, malevolent grin that froze me in place. "Welcome," he said in a low, rasping voice. "You're just in time for the ritual." I didn't wait to find out what he meant. I bolted up the stairs, not caring about the noise I was making. The door at the top of the stairs was open, and I ran through it, sprinting down the hallways, trying to retrace my steps. The house seemed to shift around me, the hallways growing longer, the doors disappearing. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, as I ran blindly through the maze. Finally, I saw a front door ahead of me. I lunged for it, throwing it open, and stumbled out into the foggy night. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I jumped in, started the engine, and sped away without looking back. The fog seemed to follow me, clinging to the car as I drove back to town. When I got back to the pizza place, I was pale and shaking. I told my manager what had happened, but he just looked at me like I was crazy. He checked the order history and found no record of any delivery to that address. It was as if the order had never existed. I never went back to that area again. The memory of that unfinished house still haunts me, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever was inside is still out there, waiting for the next unlucky soul to wander in. Story 2. The Vanishing Customer. One night, I was working the late shift delivering food for a Chinese restaurant. It was a quiet night, and I was looking forward to finishing my last few deliveries and heading home. Around 11 p.m., I received an order for a delivery to an old apartment building on the edge of town. The building was in a rundown neighborhood that I tried to avoid whenever possible. The streets were poorly lit, and the buildings all had a neglected, almost abandoned feel to them. But an order was an order, so I headed over. When I arrived at the address, I was surprised to see that the building was in even worse shape than I'd imagined. The windows were broken, and the front door was hanging off its hinges. I checked the address again, thinking I must have made a mistake, but it matched the one on my receipt. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to go in. The inside of the building was even worse. The walls were peeling, and the floor was littered with trash. The dim light from my phone was the only source of illumination as I made my way down the hallway. The order was for apartment 3B. I climbed the creaky stairs to the third floor, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty building. When I reached the apartment, I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a faint voice from inside the apartment, almost like a whisper. "Come in." The door creaked open slightly, and I could see the dark interior of the apartment. The air inside was stale, and there was a faint smell of something rotting. Every instinct told me to leave, but I couldn't just abandon the order. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was almost completely empty, except for a single chair in the center of the room. The walls were bare, and the windows were covered with heavy, dark curtains. "Hello?" I called out, but there was no response. The voice I had heard was gone. I placed the food on the floor near the door, planning to leave as quickly as possible. But as I turned to go, I noticed something odd. There were no signs of life in the apartment. No personal items, no furniture, nothing that indicated anyone actually lived there. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart started pounding as I realized I was trapped. The room began to feel oppressive, like the walls were closing in on me. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath in the dim light. Then, I heard the voice again, this time louder and more insistent. "Stay." I felt a cold hand brush against my arm, and I jumped back in terror. There was no one there, but I could feel a presence all around me, something malevolent and unseen. Desperate, I ran to the door and yanked it open. I bolted out of the apartment and down the stairs, not caring about the noise I was making. As I reached the lobby, I heard the door of the apartment slam shut behind me with a deafening bang. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me a few tries to get the keys into the ignition. I floored the gas pedal and sped away, not daring to look back at the building. When I returned to the restaurant, I was pale and trembling. I told my coworkers what had happened, but they just laughed and said it must have been a prank. But I knew it was something more than that. The next day, I tried to find the apartment building again to prove to myself that it was real. But when I drove back to the address, the building was gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. There was no sign that a building had ever been there. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never take a late-night delivery to an unfamiliar address again. Story 3. The Endless Drive. This story happened on a night when the fog was so thick you could barely see the road in front of you. I was delivering for a local burger joint, and it was the last delivery of my shift. The order came from an address I didn't recognize, somewhere on the outskirts of town. The GPS showed it as a rural area, not far from the edge of a dense forest. The drive started normally, but as I got closer to the location, the fog thickened and the road became harder to navigate. My headlights barely cut through the mist, and the trees on either side of the road loomed like shadowy figures. Eventually, the road turned from pavement to gravel, and I found myself driving deeper into the forest. The GPS insisted I was going the right way, but the road was getting narrower, almost like a trail. There were no street lights, no houses, just the dark, silent forest pressing in from all sides. I started to feel uneasy, but I was almost at the address, so I kept going. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached the location, but instead of a house, I found myself in front of a small clearing in the middle of the woods. There was no sign of a building, just a circle of trees surrounding the empty space. I checked the GPS again, but it showed that I had arrived. Confused and more than a little creeped out, I decided to call the customer to clarify the location. But as I pulled out my phone, I realized there was no signal. The feeling of unease turned into full-blown fear. I didn't want to stay there any longer than necessary, so I decided to turn around and head back to the main road. But as I started to drive away, something strange happened. The road didn't seem to lead back the way I had come. No matter which way I turned, the road twisted and turned in unfamiliar directions, leading me deeper into the forest. The trees grew denser and the fog thickened, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I tried to follow the GPS, but it was completely useless, showing me driving in circles. Panic set in as I realized I was lost in the middle of nowhere. I tried to stay calm, thinking maybe I had just taken a wrong turn. But as the minutes turned into hours, I started to fear I might never find my way out. Just when I was starting to lose hope, I saw a light up ahead. It was dim and flickering, but it was the first sign of civilization I had seen in hours. I sped toward it, hoping to find someone who could help me. As I got closer, I realized it was an old gas station, the kind you'd expect to see in a horror movie. The lights were flickering, and the place looked like it hadn't been in use for years. But I didn't care. I was desperate. I parked the car and got out, calling out for anyone who might be inside. The only response was the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. The place was completely deserted. I walked around the station, looking for any sign of life. That's when I noticed something strange. My car was no longer where I had parked it. I spun around, searching the area, but it had vanished, leaving me stranded in the middle of the forest. A sense of dread washed over me as I realized how truly alone I was. The fog seemed to close in, and the forest grew darker, as if the night itself was swallowing me whole. I ran to the door of the gas station, hoping to find shelter inside. But as I reached for the handle, I heard a sound behind me, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on gravel. I froze, too terrified to turn around. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right behind me. I could feel a presence, something cold and malevolent, breathing down my neck. Summoning every ounce of courage, I spun around, but there was nothing there. The forest was silent, the fog thick and impenetrable. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran into the gas station, slamming the door behind me. The inside was as dilapidated as the outside, with broken shelves and dusty old signs. But it felt safer than being out in the open. I hid behind the counter, my heart racing, waiting for the dawn to break. The hours dragged on, and I could hear strange noises outside, whispers, rustling, the occasional thud against the walls. But I didn't dare move. When the first light of morning finally broke through the fog, I cautiously stepped outside. The forest was still and silent, and my car was back where I had left it. Shaking with relief, I jumped in and sped away, not caring about the dirt road or the dense fog. I never found out what happened that night, and I never went back to that part of town. I quit my delivery job the next day. No amount of money was worth risking another night like that. More food delivery horror stories. Story 4. The Wrong House. It was a quiet Tuesday night, and I was doing my usual rounds as a delivery driver for a local sushi restaurant. The night had been uneventful, with only a few deliveries scattered across town. Then, I received an order for an address I hadn't seen before, located in a suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The GPS guided me to a cul-de-sac with only 3 houses, all dark and seemingly empty. The house number on the order didn't quite match any of the houses there, but it was close enough to one of them, a large old Victorian-style house with a wraparound porch. The place was in decent shape, but there was something about it that gave me a bad feeling. It looked like it had been frozen in time, with no signs of life around it. I pulled up to the house and double-checked the address. It wasn't exact, but it was the closest match, and there were no other houses nearby. Figuring it might just be a typo, I grabbed the bag of sushi and headed to the front door. The porch creaked under my feet as I walked up the steps. The air felt heavy, and I could hear the faint rustling of leaves in the distance. I knocked on the door and waited, but there was no answer. I knocked again, harder this time, and called out, "Hello, your delivery is here." After a few moments, I heard footsteps inside the house, slowly approaching the door. The handle turned, and the door creaked open just a crack. Through the small opening, I could see a pair of eyes staring back at me, wide and unblinking. "Delivery for Mr. Jenkins?" I asked, holding up the bag. The person behind the door didn't respond. The eyes just stared at me, unblinking. The silence was unnerving, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Still no response. The eyes didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. Feeling increasingly uncomfortable, I set the bag down on the porch. "I'll just leave this here," I said, stepping back. "Have a good night." As I turned to leave, the door creaked open a bit more, and I heard a voice, a low, raspy whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." I froze, my heart racing. I didn't dare turn around. The voice sounded wrong, like it was struggling to speak. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there. I bolted down the steps and ran to my car, not looking back. As I fumbled with the keys, I heard the door behind me slam shut with a loud bang. The sound echoed through the empty cul-de-sac, and the porch light flickered out, plunging the house into darkness. I sped away, not caring about the speed limit. When I was a safe distance away, I pulled over and called the restaurant, explaining what had happened. My manager was confused. There was no record of an order for Mr. Jenkins. In fact, there was no Mr. Jenkins in the system at all. Shaken, I drove back to the restaurant and handed over the bag of sushi. My manager suggested I take the rest of the night off, and I gladly accepted. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, so I did some research on the address. What I found sent chills down my spine. The house I had delivered to had been abandoned for years, ever since the previous owner and Mr. Jenkins had died under mysterious circumstances. It turned out that the house was notorious in the neighborhood. Local kids dared each other to knock on the door, but no one ever saw anyone go in or out. Some claimed to have seen strange lights in the windows late at night, but no one had lived there for over a decade. I never returned to that neighborhood again, and I quit my job as a delivery driver soon after. Whatever I encountered that night was something I never wanted to experience again. Story 5. The Empty Apartment. It was around midnight when I got a delivery request for a high-rise apartment building downtown. The order seemed normal enough, just a couple of pizzas and some drinks. The customer had requested delivery to their door, so I headed over to the building. The lobby was eerily quiet when I arrived, and the doorman was nowhere to be seen. Usually, there was at least a security guard on duty, but the place was deserted. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just a quiet night. I took the elevator up to the 13th floor, where the customer's apartment was located. As I stepped out of the elevator, I noticed something strange. The entire floor was dark, with only the dim emergency lights flickering on and off. The hallway was long and lined with identical doors, each one numbered in shiny brass. I found the apartment number and knocked, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, and called out, "Pizza delivery." After a few seconds, I heard the sound of a lock clicking, and the door slowly creaked open. But instead of being greeted by a customer, I was met with complete darkness. The apartment beyond the door was pitch black, and I couldn't see anyone inside. "Hello?" I called out, peering into the darkness. A cold draft blew out from the apartment, carrying with it a musty, stale odor. I felt a strong sense of unease, like I was being watched by something just out of sight. I took a step back, ready to leave, when I heard a voice, a soft, almost childlike whisper coming from deep within the apartment. "Come in." Every instinct told me to turn around and get out of there, but something compelled me to take a step forward. The darkness seemed to swallow me as I crossed the threshold, and the door slammed shut behind me with a force that made me jump. I was plunged into total darkness, unable to see even a few inches in front of me. I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight, but the moment I turned it on, the light flickered and died. My phone was fully charged, but it was as if something had drained the battery in an instant. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped in the apartment with no way to see or communicate. The air was thick and heavy, and I could hear faint whispers all around me, like disembodied voices talking just out of earshot. I reached out, trying to find the door, but instead, my hand brushed against something cold and clammy. I recoiled in horror, but before I could react, I felt a strong force shove me forward. I stumbled, trying to catch my balance, but the floor seemed to shift beneath me. Suddenly, I was falling through what felt like endless darkness. My stomach lurched as I plummeted, unable to see or understand what was happening. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, like a chorus of voices all around me. Just as suddenly as it began, the falling stopped and I hit the ground hard. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I lay there, gasping for breath in the darkness. Slowly, the darkness began to lift, and I found myself lying on the floor of the apartment building's lobby. The overhead lights were flickering back on, and I could hear the distant hum of the elevator returning to the 13th floor. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding. The lobby was just as empty as when I had arrived, and there was no sign of the pizzas or the apartment I had just been in. Shaking with fear, I ran out of the building and into the night. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, where I sat for several minutes, trying to calm down. I never went back to that building, and I never found out what happened in that apartment. The memory of those whispers and the sensation of falling into darkness still haunt me to this day. Story 6. The Midnight Caller. I had been working as a delivery driver for a few years, and by then, I thought I had seen it all. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened one cold winter night. It was just after midnight, and I was on the last delivery of my shift. The order came in from a customer who lived in a remote part of town near the old cemetery. The neighborhood was sparsely populated, with only a few houses scattered along a winding road that led up a hill. The house was an old two-story structure that looked like it had been standing for over a century. The windows were dark, and the porch light flickered weakly as I approached. The wind howled through the trees, making the whole scene feel like something out of a horror movie. I walked up to the front door and knocked, but there was no answer. I waited for a few moments and knocked again, louder this time. The wind picked up, and I could hear it rattling the windows. Just as I was about to leave, the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway. I called out, "Delivery for Mr. Thompson," but there was no response. I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The hallway was long and narrow, lined with old portraits that seemed to watch me as I walked past. The air inside was stale, with a faint odor of mildew. I made my way down the hall, calling out for Mr. Thompson, but the house was eerily silent. The only sound was the creaking of the old wooden floorboards under my feet. At the end of the hallway was a door slightly ajar, with a faint light spilling out from behind it. I approached cautiously, feeling a growing sense of dread. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, only to find myself in a small, empty room. The walls were lined with dusty old bookshelves, and a single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long shadows across the floor. In the center of the room was a table, and on it was a single phone, an old rotary dial phone, the kind you'd find in an antique shop. The phone started ringing as soon as I entered the room, a sound shrill and piercing in the silence. I stared at the phone, unsure of what to do. The ringing continued, growing louder and more insistent. My instincts told me to leave, but something compelled me to pick up the receiver. The moment I lifted the receiver, the ringing stopped, and I was met with silence on the other end. I held the phone to my ear, listening intently, when suddenly I heard a voice, a low, menacing whisper. "Why are you here?" The voice sent chills down my spine. It was cold, devoid of emotion, and seemed to echo in my mind. I couldn't speak, couldn't move, just stood there, paralyzed with fear. The voice continued, "You shouldn't have come." Before I could react, the phone line went dead, and the light bulb above me flickered and went out. I was plunged into darkness, the room suddenly cold and silent. I dropped the phone and ran out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway seemed longer than before, stretching out endlessly as I sprinted toward the front door. I burst out of the house and into the freezing night, gasping for breath. The wind howled around me as I raced to my car and sped away, not daring to look back. When I reached the safety of the main road, I pulled over and tried to calm down. My hands were shaking, and I could still hear the echo of that voice in my head. I never made another delivery to that house, and I never found out who or what had called me that night. All I know is that some things are better left alone, and some places should never be visited after dark. Story 7. The house that shouldn't be there. I've been a delivery driver for years, and you'd think I'd have seen it all by now. But one night, I encountered something that still haunts me. It was a late-night delivery on the outskirts of town, part of the city I rarely visited. The address was for a house on a road I had never heard of, but the GPS directed me without issue. I followed the route, turning onto a long, narrow lane that cut through a thick forest. The further I drove, the more isolated I felt. The trees loomed over the road, their branches intertwining above me like a dark canopy. Eventually, the GPS announced that I had arrived, and I pulled up in front of an old, decrepit house. The place looked abandoned, with boarded-up windows and overgrown weeds choking the front yard. I double-checked the address. This was the place. I got out of the car, hesitating as I approached the house. The air was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind. I knocked on the door, but it creaked open under the force of my hand. Inside, the house was dark and smelled of dampness and decay. I called out, announcing the delivery, but no one answered. I was about to leave when I noticed something strange. The temperature had dropped significantly. My breath was visible in the cold air, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Despite every instinct telling me to leave, I stepped further into the house. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I made my way down a dimly lit hallway. The walls were covered in faded, peeling wallpaper, and the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. At the end of the hallway was a closed door. As I approached, I could hear faint whispers coming from the other side. The voices were indistinct, like multiple people talking at once, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the doorknob. The moment I touched it, the whispers stopped, and the house fell into an eerie silence. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. Inside was a small, dusty room with a single chair in the center. On the chair sat a mannequin dressed in old, tattered clothing. Its face was covered with a cracked porcelain mask, and its head was tilted as if it were staring at me. The sight was unsettling, but what really terrified me was what happened next. As I stepped into the room, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the walls. The light bulb overhead flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I scrambled for my phone to use as a flashlight, but when I turned it on, the screen was filled with static. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped in the room. Then I heard the whispers again, louder this time, surrounding me. They seemed to be coming from the mannequin, which I could barely make out in the darkness. The air grew colder, and I could feel the presence of something, no, multiple things, in the room with me. Suddenly, the mannequin's head snapped toward me, the sound of cracking porcelain echoing through the room. The whispers grew frantic, and I could feel something cold brushing against my skin, like invisible hands reaching out for me. I pounded on the door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't give. The whispers turned into screams, a cacophony of voices crying out in anguish. I could feel my sanity slipping away as the darkness closed in around me. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the door flew open and I stumbled out into the hallway. The house was silent again, the whispers gone, but the cold still lingered in the air. I didn't waste a second. I ran out of the house and straight to my car. As I sped away, I glanced back in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the old house fading into the distance, but to my shock, it was gone. The road behind me was empty, the house vanished as if it had never been there. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing with confusion and fear. I quit my job the next day. I couldn't bring myself to go back out on the road, not after what I had experienced. I don't know what that house was or what happened to me that night, but I do know one thing. Some places aren't meant to be found, and some deliveries are better left undelivered. Story 8. The Ghostly Farewell. It was a cold, rainy night when I got the call for a delivery to a nursing home on the far side of town. The order was for a single meal, just a bowl of soup and some bread. The address wasn't unfamiliar to me, but I had never delivered to that nursing home before. I arrived at the facility just as the rain was starting to come down harder. The building was old but well kept, with a warm glow emanating from the windows. I parked the car and made my way to the front entrance, the rain soaking through my jacket. Inside, the nursing home was quiet. The night shift staff greeted me with tired smiles, and I made my way down the long corridor to the room number on the order. The hallways were dimly lit, and the only sound was the soft hum of the heating system. I reached the room at the end of the hall and knocked softly. An elderly woman's voice called out, telling me to come in. I opened the door to find a small, cozy room with a single bed by the window. An old woman, frail and with a kind smile, was sitting up in bed. "Thank you for bringing my dinner," she said in a voice that was barely more than a whisper. I set the meal down on the bedside table and turned to leave, but she called me back. "Would you mind staying for a moment?" she asked. "It's been so long since I've had company." I hesitated, but something in her voice compelled me to stay. I pulled up a chair and sat down beside her bed. We talked for a while. She told me stories from her youth, about her family, and about how much she missed them. There was a sadness in her eyes that tugged at my heart. After a while, she grew tired and lay back against the pillows. "Thank you," she whispered. "It was nice to have someone to talk to, even if just for a little while." I nodded and got up to leave. As I reached the door, she spoke again, her voice soft and distant. "Please tell my daughter I love her, and I'll see her again someday." I paused, unsure of how to respond. I turned back to her, but she had already closed her eyes, a peaceful expression on her face. I quietly left the room and made my way back to the front desk. As I was leaving, I mentioned the woman's message to the nurse at the front desk. The nurse looked at me with a puzzled expression. "Are you sure you were in the right room?" she asked. I nodded, describing the room and the woman I had spoken to. The nurse's face went pale. "That room has been empty for years," she said quietly. "The woman who lived there passed away 5 years ago. She used to order the same meal every night, soup and bread. She always waited by the window, hoping her daughter would visit." A cold chill ran down my spine as the nurse told me the story. I left the nursing home in a daze, my mind racing. Had I really spoken to a ghost? Or was it just some kind of strange coincidence? I never found out the truth, but I couldn't shake the feeling that what I had experienced was real. To this day, I can still hear her voice, soft and full of longing, as she said her final farewell. Story 9. The Unseen Passenger. This happened a few months ago when I was working as both a food delivery driver and a rideshare driver to make ends meet. It was a busy Saturday night, and after completing several food deliveries, I decided to switch over to rideshare mode to pick up some passengers. I got a request to pick someone up from an address not too far from where I had just completed a delivery. It was in an older part of town, where the streets were narrow and the houses were close together, many of them built decades ago. When I arrived at the location, there was no one waiting outside, which wasn't too unusual. Sometimes, passengers took a few minutes to come out, so I waited. After a few moments, I got a text from the rider saying they were on their way out. I glanced at the rearview mirror and saw a shadowy figure approaching the car. The street was poorly lit, so I couldn't make out much detail, but I assumed it was my passenger. The figure opened the back door and got in, but when I turned around to greet them, the seat behind me was empty. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but there was no one there. The back door was shut, and I hadn't heard anyone leave. My heart started racing, but I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just my imagination. I looked at the app to see if the ride had been cancelled, but it still showed the passenger as on board. Confused and more than a little creeped out, I decided to drive anyway, thinking maybe the app had glitched. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the car. Every few minutes, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone sitting in the backseat. But each time, the seat was empty. The destination was a cemetery on the edge of town. By the time I arrived, my nerves were on edge. The place was dark and deserted, with only a few scattered streetlights casting eerie shadows over the tombstones. I pulled up to the entrance and waited, hoping that somehow this ride would end normally. But there was no one to drop off. The app still showed the passenger as on board, but the seat was empty and there was no one to say goodbye to. Suddenly, the temperature in the car dropped, and I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I turned around, but there was nothing there, just the empty seat and the dark night beyond the windows. My hands were shaking as I ended the ride on the app. The passenger disappeared from the screen, leaving no trace behind. I drove away from the cemetery as fast as I could, not daring to look back. To this day, I don't know who or what got into my car that night. All I know is that I haven't driven through that part of town since, and I'd always double-check the backseat before I start driving. Story 10. The Midnight Diner. It was around 1 a.m. on a Friday night, and the city was quieting down. I had just finished a string of deliveries and was about to call it a night when I received one last order. It was from a 24-hour diner located in an industrial area on the outskirts of town. The kind of place where you wouldn't expect much traffic, especially at that hour. The order was for a single burger and fries, a simple meal. The address was unfamiliar to me, but I was too tired to give it much thought. I accepted the delivery and drove to the diner. When I arrived, the diner looked like something out of an old horror movie, flickering neon lights, a single car in the parking lot, and a dense fog that seemed to cling to the ground. I parked my car and went inside to pick up the order. The diner was eerily empty. The only person there was an older man behind the counter who barely looked up when I walked in. The place was filled with the smell of grease and coffee, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The man handed me the bag of food without a word, and I thanked him before heading back to my car. As I got into the car and entered the address into my GPS, I noticed something strange. The destination was marked in the middle of nowhere. It was on a road that didn't seem to lead to any particular building or house. The thought of driving out there in the dead of night made me uneasy, but I shrugged it off and started the drive. The road was dark and winding, cutting through thick woods that seemed to close in around me as I drove deeper into the night. The trees were tall and ancient, their branches forming twisted shapes against the sky. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under my tires. After about 15 minutes, the GPS announced that I had arrived. But there was nothing there, no house, no lights, just an empty stretch of road surrounded by dense forest. Confused, I double-checked the address, but it was correct. I sat in my car, unsure of what to do. I considered calling the customer, but when I pulled up the order details on my phone, the number was missing. There was only a blank space where the phone number should have been. That's when I noticed something even more unsettling. The timestamp on the order was wrong. It was dated for the same day, but for a time hours before I had even accepted it. A chill ran down my spine, and I suddenly felt like I was being watched. I glanced around, but there was nothing but darkness and the thick trees surrounding me. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but I hesitated, feeling an inexplicable urge to complete the delivery. I grabbed the bag of food and stepped out of the car. The air was cold, and the silence was oppressive. I walked a few steps toward the trees, thinking maybe there was a path I couldn't see from the car, but there was nothing, just an impenetrable wall of trees. As I turned to go back to the car, I heard something, a faint rustling sound coming from the woods. I froze, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, like something was moving through the underbrush, coming closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly backed toward the car, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Just as I reached the car door, I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall and gaunt, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I couldn't make out any features, but I could feel its gaze locked on me. Panic surged through me, and I jumped into the car, slamming the door shut. I fumbled to start the engine, my hands trembling with fear. As the car roared to life, the figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. I floored the gas pedal, speeding away from the spot as fast as I could. The road twisted and turned, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had seen, but nothing about it made sense. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over to catch my breath. My hands were still shaking, and my heart was pounding in my ears. I checked the order again, hoping it was some kind of glitch, but the details were still there. An order from a diner that should have been routine, but had turned into a nightmare. I never found out who or what placed that order. The next day, I drove back to the diner to ask about it, but when I arrived, I found the place boarded up and abandoned, as if it hadn't been in business for years. The neon sign was dark, and the windows were covered in grime. There was no sign of the man who had handed me the food, and the lot was empty. That night was my last as a delivery driver. The memory of that figure in the woods and the eerie silence that surrounded me still haunts my dreams. Some orders, it seems, are better left undelivered. Story 11. The apartment that shouldn't exist. I was working the late shift on a rainy night when I received an order for a high-rise apartment building downtown. The address was familiar, as I had delivered there many times before, so I didn't think much of it. The order was for a couple of sandwiches and drinks, nothing unusual. I arrived at the building, parked, and made my way inside. The lobby was empty, the only sound the rain tapping against the large glass windows. I took the elevator up to the 14th floor, where the apartment was located. When the elevator doors opened, I was greeted by a long, dimly lit hallway. The building was old, with creaky floors and peeling wallpaper, but it had always been well maintained. As I walked down the hall, I noticed that something felt off, the air was heavy, and there was a faint, unpleasant smell like something rotting. I found the apartment number and knocked on the door. After a few moments, it opened just a crack, and a pale, thin hand reached out to take the food. I tried to get a glimpse of the person inside, but the door was mostly closed, and the light inside was too dim to see anything clearly. The hand quickly pulled the food inside, and before I could say anything, the door slammed shut. The whole interaction left me feeling uneasy, but I brushed it off as just another odd customer. I turned to head back to the elevator, but as I walked, I realized something strange. The hallway seemed longer than before. I had counted the doors on my way to the apartment, but now there seemed to be more of them. The walls looked older, more worn, and the lights overhead flickered weakly. A sense of dread started to creep over me as I hurried down the hallway, trying to reach the elevator. But the further I walked, the longer the hallway stretched. It was as if the building was changing around me, trapping me in its endless corridors. I started running, panic setting in, but no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't reach the elevator. The hallway twisted and turned, and soon I was completely disoriented. The walls began to close in, and the air grew colder, the smell of decay becoming overwhelming. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard something, soft footsteps behind me, getting closer. I turned around, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps continued, echoing off the walls, coming closer and closer. I ran faster, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but the footsteps kept pace with me, never falling behind. I could feel something cold and malevolent closing in, the air around me growing thicker with each step. Finally, I rounded a corner and saw the elevator at the end of the hall. I sprinted toward it, slamming my hand against the button. The doors opened, and I practically threw myself inside, frantically pressing the button for the ground floor. The doors closed just as I heard the footsteps reach the elevator, but they stopped abruptly as the elevator began its descent. The ride down was agonizingly slow, the elevator creaking and groaning as it made its way to the lobby. When the doors finally opened, I bolted out, not stopping until I was outside in the rain. I looked up at the building, half expecting to see something in one of the windows, but there was nothing, just the dark, looming structure against the night sky. I never went back to that building again. Later, I heard rumors about a fire that had broken out in one of the upper floors years ago, and that some of the residents had never been found. People claimed that the building was haunted, that sometimes the 14th floor would appear different, as if trapped in time. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I know it wasn't something natural. Some places are cursed, and some doors should never be opened. Story 12. The delivery that never ended. It was a stormy night, and I was close to finishing my shift when I got an order from a house on the outskirts of town. The address was on a road I didn't recognize, but it wasn't uncommon to get orders from remote areas, so I accepted it without much thought. As I drove out to the location, the rain started coming down harder, making it difficult to see the road. My GPS struggled to keep a signal, but eventually it guided me to a narrow dirt road that wound through a dense forest. The trees were tall and thick, their branches swaying in the wind. I followed the road for what felt like miles, the rain pounding on the roof of my car. Just when I thought I must have taken a wrong turn, I saw a faint light up ahead. I drove toward it, and eventually, a large old house came into view, its windows glowing with a dim yellow light. I parked the car and grabbed the delivery bag, making my way up to the front door. The house was massive, with ivy-covered walls and tall, narrow windows. It looked ancient, like something out of a Gothic novel. I knocked on the door, and after a moment, it creaked open. A tall, thin man stood in the doorway, his face partially obscured by shadows. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, his skin pale and almost translucent. "Thank you for bringing the food," he said in a soft, almost whispery voice. I handed him the bag, and he nodded in appreciation. Just as I was about to turn and leave, he spoke again. "Would you mind helping me with something? It won't take long." Every instinct told me to refuse and leave immediately, but there was something compelling about his voice, something that made it impossible to say no. I nodded, and he gestured for me to follow him inside. The interior of the house was dimly lit, with antique furniture and heavy drapes that added to the oppressive atmosphere. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and something else, something metallic, like the scent of old blood. The man led me down a long hallway to a door at the end. He opened it, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. "Please follow me," he said, descending the stairs. I hesitated, but the pull to follow was overwhelming. I stepped down into the darkness, the stairs creaking under my weight. The air grew colder as we descended, and soon I could see my breath in front of me. At the bottom of the stairs was a large, stone-walled basement. The room was filled with old, dusty furniture, and in the center was a large wooden table. On the table lay an ornate silver box. The man walked over to the box and carefully lifted the lid. Inside was a set of old, yellowed papers, tied together with a frayed ribbon. "These are very important," he said, his voice echoing in the cold, empty space. "They must be delivered to my brother. He lives just beyond the woods." He handed me the box, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming dread. "You must go now," he urged. "There isn't much time." I didn't want to take the box, but my hands moved on their own, clutching it tightly. The man led me back upstairs, and as we reached the front door, he gave me a final, unsettling smile. "Thank you," he whispered. "But remember, once you leave, you must not look back." With that, he closed the door behind me, leaving me alone on the porch in the pouring rain. I hurried back to my car, the box feeling heavy in my hands. I started the engine and began driving back down the narrow dirt road, my heart pounding in my chest. The rain continued to fall, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I drove for what felt like hours, but the road seemed endless. No matter how far I went, the house remained in my rearview mirror, its lights flickering through the trees. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but something compelled me to look back. When I finally gave in, I saw the man standing in the middle of the road, his pale face illuminated by the headlights. His eyes were hollow, his mouth twisted into a chilling grin. Panic overtook me, and I floored the gas, speeding down the road as fast as I could. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't escape the feeling that he was still there, watching me waiting. Finally, the road gave way to a familiar stretch of highway, and the house disappeared from view. I pulled over, gasping for breath, the box still clutched in my hands. I didn't dare open it, and I didn't deliver it. Instead, I threw it into a nearby river, hoping to rid myself of whatever curse it carried. But the fear didn't leave me. I quit my job the next day, and I haven't driven down that road since. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I still see the house in my dreams, the man standing in the doorway, waiting for the delivery that never ended. Story 13. The Wrong House. One foggy evening, I received an order for a neighborhood I wasn't familiar with. The house was at the end of a cul-de-sac, surrounded by large trees and thick mist that gave the area an eerie, isolated feel. The GPS led me through winding roads, and soon, I found myself at the entrance of a long gravel driveway leading up to a grand old mansion. The house was massive, with ivy-covered walls and a towering iron gate that creaked as I pushed it open. There were no lights on in the house, but the order specified that it was for this address, so I drove up the driveway and parked. As I approached the front door, I noticed the house seemed to be in disrepair. The windows were dirty and cracked, the paint was peeling, and the garden was overgrown with weeds. The whole place had an unsettling vibe, but I knocked on the door anyway, hoping to complete the delivery quickly. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a dark hallway. I called out, but there was no response. I hesitated for a moment, but then I heard footsteps echoing from inside the house, followed by a soft female voice. "Please, come in," the voice said. It sounded distant, almost as if it were coming from another room far away. Every instinct told me to leave, but something about the voice drew me in. I stepped inside, the door slowly closing behind me. The hallway was long and dark, with old paintings on the walls and a musty smell hanging in the air. The footsteps continued, leading me deeper into the house. I walked down the hallway, passing door after door, all of them closed. The voice called out again, this time closer, in here. I reached a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, and a dim light flickered from within. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, only to find the room completely empty. There was no furniture, no light, and no one in sight, just an old, dusty floor and peeling wallpaper. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, and the room was plunged into darkness. Panic set in as I fumbled for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. I felt the walls closing in, the air growing colder by the second. Then the voice returned, this time a whisper in my ear, "You shouldn't have come here." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I spun around, but there was no one there. The darkness seemed to swallow me whole, and the room felt like it was shrinking, the walls pressing in on me. I started banging on the door, shouting for help, but my voice seemed to be absorbed by the thick, oppressive air. The only response was a low, menacing growl that seemed to come from all around me. Just when I thought I was going to be trapped forever, the door suddenly flew open, and I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. The house was silent now, the footsteps and voices gone. I didn't wait to find out what had happened. I ran down the hallway, out the front door, and straight to my car. As I drove away, I glanced back at the house, only to see that it was completely dark, with no sign of life inside. The next day, I contacted the delivery company to report the incident, but when I gave them the address, they told me it didn't exist. The house I had delivered to wasn't listed in their system, and no order had been placed for that night. I tried to forget about it, but the memory of that voice still haunts me. I never returned to that neighborhood, and I always double-check the addresses on my deliveries now. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that same voice whispering in my ear, "You shouldn't have come here." Story 14, The Phantom Restaurant. One night, I was driving through the city when I received an order for a restaurant I'd never heard of before. The name on the app was The Phantom Diner, and the address was in a part of town that was mostly abandoned. Curious, I accepted the order and followed the GPS to the location. The streets grew darker and more deserted as I drove further into the area. The buildings were old and crumbling, with boarded-up windows and graffiti-covered walls. Finally, I arrived at the address, but there was no restaurant in sight, just a dark alleyway between two derelict buildings. I double-checked the address, and sure enough, this was the right place. Hesitant but intrigued, I parked my car and walked down the alley. At the end, I found a small door with a faded sign above it that read The Phantom Diner. The door creaked open as I approached, and I stepped inside. The interior was unlike any restaurant I had ever seen. The walls were covered in dark wood paneling, and the dim lighting cast long shadows across the room. The place was filled with old, mismatched furniture, and the air was thick with the scent of something cooking in the kitchen. There were a few customers sitting at tables, but they all seemed oddly out of place. They were dressed in clothes that looked like they were from a different era, and their faces were pale and expressionless. None of them looked up as I entered. I approached the counter, where an elderly man stood behind a cash register. He was hunched over, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. "Pick up for order number 13, I said, handing him the receipt. The man looked up slowly, his eyes dark and hollow. He didn't say a word, just nodded and disappeared into the back kitchen. A few moments later, he returned with a paper bag and handed it to me. The bag was heavy, and the food inside smelled strangely metallic. As I turned to leave, the man spoke in a raspy voice, "Be careful on the road tonight." I nodded and quickly made my way out of the diner, the eerie atmosphere weighing heavily on me. I walked back to my car, but as I reached the street, I realized something strange. The alley I had walked down was gone. The buildings on either side were completely intact, with no sign of the door or the Phantom Diner. I stood there, bewildered, but there was no time to think. I had a delivery to complete. I got back in my car and followed the GPS to the customer's address, which was in a nearby neighborhood. When I arrived, I walked up to the door and knocked. A middle-aged woman answered, and I handed her the bag. She took it, but as she looked inside, her expression turned to confusion. "I didn't order this," she said, frowning. I checked the order details on my phone, but everything seemed to match up. "This is the address on the order," I said, feeling a growing sense of unease. The woman shook her head. "I'm sorry, but I didn't place an order. And this food," she trailed off, her face paling as she glanced at the bag. I didn't want to know what was inside. I apologized and quickly left, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just delivered something I shouldn't have. Later that night, I checked the app again, but the Phantom Diner was no longer listed. The order history was gone, as if it had never existed. I tried to put it out of my mind, but the memory of that dark alley and the strange, hollow-eyed man stayed with me. To this day, I've never been able to find any trace of the Phantom Diner. It's as if the place was a ghost, appearing only for that one night before disappearing forever. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night, I swear I see that alleyway out of the corner of my eye, and I can almost hear the old man's raspy voice warning me to be careful on the road. Story 15. The Caller in the Dark. It was a stormy night, with rain pouring down in sheets and thunder rumbling in the distance. I had just finished a delivery and was about to head home when I received a call from an unknown number. Normally, I wouldn't answer, but something about the timing made me pick up. "Hello," I said, trying to be heard over the sound of the rain. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a low, distorted voice. "Please, help me." I was taken aback. "Who is this?" The voice on the other end crackled, as if coming from a broken speaker. "I need you to deliver something. Please, it's urgent." A chill ran down my spine. "I'm not a delivery service," I replied, but the voice persisted. "Please, you're the only one who can help. I'm at the old house on Willow Lane." I knew the place. Willow Lane was an abandoned road on the outskirts of town, lined with decaying houses that had been empty for years. No one in their right mind would go there, especially not during a storm. "I don't think I can do that," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You should call the police." The voice on the other end became more desperate. "No, the police can't help me. Only you can. Please, I'm begging you." Against my better judgment, I found myself agreeing. "All right, I'll come. But if this is some kind of joke..." "No joke," the voice interrupted. "Please hurry." Story 16. The Midnight Delivery. It was a quiet night, and I was just about to finish my shift when I got a new delivery request. The address was in a part of town I didn't visit often, an old residential area with houses that seemed stuck in a bygone era. The request was for a large order of food, and the customer had specified an urgent delivery time. The GPS led me to an old Victorian-style house with an overgrown garden and a wrought iron fence. The house looked abandoned, with shutters hanging loose and an unkempt yard. It was the kind of place you'd expect to see in a ghost story, and the atmosphere only added to the unsettling feeling I had. I parked the car and approached the front door, which was slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. The air was thick with dust and the smell of mildew. I called out, "Delivery," but there was no response. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. I walked further into the house, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty rooms. I reached what appeared to be a dining room, and there, sitting at the table, was a large, ornate box. It was covered in strange symbols and looked as though it had been there for decades. I set the food down next to it and turned to leave when I heard a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper coming from behind me. I turned around and saw nothing but shadows. The whispering continued, growing louder and more urgent. The symbols on the box seemed to shift and change, as though they were alive. A cold draft swept through the room, causing the flickering bulb to go out completely. I reached for my phone to call the customer, but when I looked at the screen, the delivery details had vanished. The GPS showed that I was no longer at the location, but I was still standing in the same room. Panic set in, and I ran back to the front door, but it was now completely closed and locked. The whispering grew louder, filling the room with an otherworldly intensity. Shadows danced around me, and I could feel a cold, malevolent presence closing in. Desperate, I kicked the door with all my might, and it finally gave way. I stumbled out into the night, not daring to look back. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw nothing but darkness. The address was gone from the app, and the house had vanished as if it had never been there. I never spoke of the incident, but the memory of that night still haunts me. Sometimes I hear whispers in the dark, and I wonder if that box is still waiting for someone to deliver it.